Before I tell you who I am, I have to tell you where I come from. Growing up, I always had, well, people tried to give me one identity or another, either a woman or deaf or Pakistani or whatever. People were trying to make me separate that, but we call it intersectionality. So I'll talk briefly about intersectionality. And I'm a product of all these various identities, multiple identities. I cannot pull them apart and separate them. So keep that in mind as I talk about my journey. This was a quote by Carla Garcia Fernandez. This was from her PhD dissertation about deaf Latino students. It was really a fascinating research article. Really, why I'm here is because of this concept right here, deaf same. If you travel the world and you find a deaf person, we feel like we're the same. I'm the same. We're both deaf. So I found this research 2 years ago by Friedner and Kusters, and it's a lot about connections. And that's one of the reasons I'm here, to build connections here at RIT, at the U of R, with the RPP program, and with Bridges. So thank you. I'm very honored to be here and to be just like you all. My personal background includes all of these items listed here. I'm a female, a woman of color, a first-generation American-born. My parents are from Pakistan. I'm deaf, I'm Muslim, I'm a scientist, I'm a doctor. All of those things make up who I am. Here's a bit of family and some pictures. My father came first in the 1970s from Pakistan to the US. He found a civil engineering job. That's a very similar in my culture. Many people are engineers or attorneys. He went back to Pakistan, married my mom, moved back to the US, and I was born in Houston, Texas. My parents had no idea I was deaf until I was 3 and a half. I had no language or anything at that time. My grandma flew here from Pakistan to visit, and this was their first child for my parents. I was their first child, and so my grandma suspected something. When they found out, my mom was just freaking out. She cried. She didn't know what to do. But a social worker came to the house and let my parents know that they shouldn't worry about how I became deaf, but they needed to focus on me developing language because I had no language at that time. Fortunately, my parents paid attention to the social worker and put me in a school in Texas at that time. They had a strong simultaneous communication program. My whole family is hearing. I had a brother, and growing up, I was a child of immigrants. I went through all the culture clashes. For example, when I was 16, letting my parents know that it was time for me to get a driver's license because in America, the age was 16 and they said, no, we have to wait until you're 18 because that's what we're used to. So we had some arguments about that and we had several conflicts similar to that, me being the first generation born in America. But I wanted to mention this because it took an outside person, a social worker, to come to my home to expose or to teach my parents that I should be exposed to deaf culture and language. And that was very important. And that has impacted my life growing up. I know you all wish you could be there in California. So I grew up and went to Riverside. And we were near an Air Force base. I was mainstreamed growing up. Sometimes I was the only deaf person in a school of hearing individuals. Sometimes I would need help and go to a tutor. For my social time off, I got to interact with other deaf students if I was maybe in a separate class just by me, but often I was made fun of. The interpreter situation was not perfect. My speech was not perfect. I tried to fit in, but it was a struggle. In 7th grade, they had a spelling bee. But really, in 5th grade, I was in a different school, an elementary school, and they had a spelling bee competition. And I thought I would go ahead and give it a try. My teacher at that time said, "You're deaf, you can't do this. How are you going to compete? I mean, you're going to tell, the interpreter will tell you the answer." And so I accepted that response at the time. I didn't know any better. So I got to middle school in 7th grade, and I decided to try, and my teacher encouraged me to try it out this time, the spelling bee. The other school, my elementary school, the teacher said that that wasn't a good idea, but in 7th grade, my teacher encouraged me. And so instead of spelling the word with fingerspelling or sign, I would try and use my speech. And then I practiced so hard, and I won. I remember in 7th grade hearing my hearing peers made fun of me and said that I was stupid and I couldn't really do it. But in 8th grade, I showed them that I could. That was a validating life in my point. And I realized that I can do things that I want to do. I may need to study hard, and I did, and became valedictorian of my class. And then in high school, I became valedictorian in my class again. All my peers were talking about UCLA and UC Berkeley and CSUN and other California schools and universities. I applied to all of the UC schools, and I got a scholarship for UC Berkeley. And I mean, you know, I thought, well, I had this educational opportunity I needed to go to. In high school is when I became very fascinated with science. And in a biology class, I first learned about genetics. And I realized, oh, DNA can possibly tell me how I became deaf. So I just fell in love with that topic, with genetic research and biology itself. So as a senior in high school, I went to school half a day, and Riverside was nearby. And so I applied for a tutoring position at Riverside, and I would go for a year. My senior year, I met a lot of people. I had deaf peers that I met there, and that was my first job there. UC Berkeley was culture shock for me, from more of a hippie area. And then there were other people that were in different majors that I knew. It was a large university and large classes. One of my classes had 700 students in it in a large auditorium. So I felt like just a number. And I already knew that I wanted to major in biology. But there was one secret door that I saw all the Black and Latino students going through. And in my dorm, there was a girl that lived next to me, and she would go to this special program, and she was Black herself. I was asking her about what she was doing with this group, and she said, "It's extra support that I'm getting." I was telling her that I was struggling with interpreters and getting through class, and the class was 700 students in one class. I felt isolated. She told me I should go and talk with this program that she was participating in. So I did, and I said, "I know that this is for different races." At that time, they were saying Asians were a model minority. And this was at UC Berkeley. It's about 75% Asian, or was at that time. So I explained to them that I'm deaf, and I wasn't sure if I would qualify for their support services, that program. And that was the first time that I used the term underrepresented minority to describe myself, being a deaf person. So I thought about applying. I went ahead and filled out the application and applied, and that program was funded by HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So I applied for the program, and they accepted me, and oh my goodness, it was such a relief. They provided me so much support and community. We had study group classes, people that were in same classes as me. We would have one-on-one sessions that really helped me graduate from UC Berkeley. Also, at the same time, I took a public health class and just fell in love with it. I was already trying to learn how I became deaf and working at the deaf school, and I wanted to help my community that I grew up with, and so I learned more from this public health introduction class. Now, I was interested in science. My first research job was at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, LBNL, and it was up on top of a beautiful hill in Berkeley. Beautiful campus. I worked with Mina Bissell in her lab, and it was very fascinating. She was ahead of her time. She believed that extracellular matrices influenced cell transformation. At that time, this was a novel concept, and people thought it was only genetics, but really no, the environment influences these processes. So I worked in her lab for about 9 months. I was funded by HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. At the end, I gave a presentation to an audience. It was a great experience. Oh, if you have time to learn about her story, it's amazing. So she had a chemist background and did bacterial geneticist research. And then she did research on oncogenic viruses. And she changed the environment to see the changes that were affected. And it became sort of common sense. She did not have a biology background. She had a chemistry background. So her thinking was a bit different from biologists. So from that, she transitioned to breast cancer research and has just been amazing in her field. But now, context matters. That's very important and something that she taught us. So my parents encouraged me to do whatever I wanted. So at the end of Berkeley, or nearing the end of my time at Berkeley, my senior year, well, many pre-meds are at Berkeley. It's very competitive. I was influenced by this competitive environment, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to do medicine, but I was interested in research. So during my senior year, another dorm mate was a pre-vet student, and she saw an article that was recently published about Frank Hockman and Judith Paksharaz. Frank Hockman was in Fremont near Berkeley, so I got on the BART system and traveled to see him. We had a great conversation. I'm deaf. I use an interpreter, but he went through school without an interpreter because he's mostly an oral user, and so he didn't sign very well. I was asking him about the stethoscope, and he said that he can hear, with the stethoscope, which I couldn't really do. So I figured that maybe medical school wouldn't be the idea for me. But then during Thanksgiving, I went home near LA. My home was in Southern California. This is near UCLA. I got in touch with Dr. Pakshars, and she is the first MD PhD who was deaf. And that was before, well, I guess this was in 1979 that she started school. And she was explaining to me that she got her PhD first in microbiology, and then she wanted to go to medical school. She did and became a doctor. She became a pathologist specifically. So I thought maybe she doesn't see and interact with patients. She is completely deaf, uses ASL. So I asked her how she uses a stethoscope. She said, well, I asked a bioengineer to build an instrument specifically for me to be able to see this. And so I have this machine, and it shows the heartbeats or the lungs, the sounds that the lungs make. It was very cool. It was very nice to meet her. And wow, I mean, she was a strong ASL user. And I realized through her experience that I could make this happen also. After graduating at Berkeley, I realized, I might be able to go to medical school. So I needed to take more classes and the MCAT. So I took more post-bac classes at UCLA. I still loved public health at that time. So I applied to Dartmouth. And really, it was very cool. I think I went from a class of about 700 to 50 or 75 per class, and I enjoyed it. I really cherished that environment. It was very valuable. I was able to learn much better in a small class environment. I found it unique. They focused on clinical evaluative sciences, quality improvement, epidemiology also, but they added the quality improvement and evaluation of that. So medical and healthcare systems kind of use a business model. This was in 2004. At that time I thought, where is the health research? In 2004 there wasn't much, and I wanted to research health issues. I wanted to do more work with deaf health, which led me to working back in California at GLAD, G-L-A-D. They had a teen pregnancy prevention program, community education. I worked as an outreach specialist and community health educator. I traveled educating others, and there were community programs for sexual education, but not that were taught in ASL. I learned how to teach these classes, and then there was a pre and post test that I would provide so that I could have an evaluation process to know where to improve. And we wanted to provide this sex education to deaf kids in ASL. I wanted more. I still wanted more. So by then I had taken the MCAT. Many of my friends went to SGU, St. George's University. I didn't go directly to medical school after college. I worked and then went back to school and worked and went back to school. So I contacted my vocational rehab department or counselor and asked what they might be able to help us with. They said that they could help with remote captioning for my classes. I flew to St. George's University and found out right before classes that this would not work. They get federal funding, but this area is outside of the U.S., and so it didn't qualify. And so I couldn't do the School of Medicine here. I was trying to stay positive and figure out what I wanted to do or could do. So I told my teachers that I need ASL access for the clinical skills and for the lab experiences as well. My teachers were very sweet, and they announced to the class, one of them did, anyone know sign language? Oh, this poor deaf girl, she needs help. And no, that was not the case. But anyway, so 2 students raised their hand. They, know ASL 2 or 3. And so they asked if they would go to the lab with me. In a couple of the labs, I felt like I was a burden because these students had to come, but they would kind of explain what the person speaking would say. And really, it was a fascinating experience. But over time, I found 2 other women who were religious. One was Mormon, and she had done 1 year of mission work with deaf individuals. And so she would interpret for me for the clinical skills. And then the other woman was a Jehovah's Witness, and it's fascinating how it happened. I was paying them through my student loans to pay for the interpreting services, but really it just was an interesting time, this one block of time, but the island was beautiful. I had a good time. I did. Then after 2 years focusing on science, life happens. My father became ill with heart problems. He had congestive heart failure, so I flew back to California to take care of him. He was in the ICU for about 3 years, and I cared for him during that time. He had many, many surgeries over this time, and then he eventually had a heart transplant. Happily, thankfully, he's fine now. but that somewhat derailed me from my classmates. They graduated, and I was now stuck and a little bit behind. I was depressed. I'm sad that I didn't graduate with them. And growing up, I always compared myself with other hearing people and felt like I wasn't at the same level. But I accepted that life happens and it's okay, and I just kept moving on. I told my school to please just put me anywhere for a rotation after the 2 years. So they said, fine, we'll send you to London. Okay, I went to London. It was a very cool experience. And rotations, all of my lab rotations were there in London, and I learned a lot about the national health system. How the systems there are different from the systems here in America. And one thing is how interpreting happens. I don't qualify for this access to work because I'm not British, but deaf individuals in Britain get an access to work program. They all have a certain amount of money, and they can use that money for paying for interpreters, for whatever appointments they might need, for note-taking services, for, sometimes people need car services. They can use that money for that. It's a really cool system. I had been worrying so much about interpreters and who would pay for that. These individuals in Britain don't have that concern. Now brings me to Washington, D.C. I graduated medical school. At that time, I was offered to apply for DAWN, formerly known as the Deaf Abused Women's Network. And I had public health skills, I knew budgeting and financing. So the board voted me in to become the executive director for DAWN. I helped DAWN continue their services, and that has been one of the most humble experiences in my life, working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and really it opened my eyes to their trauma. They're deaf, so they're already oppressed, and then they have additional trauma on top of that. So I came from a holistic approach. The medical field just wants to fix something. But with this trauma-informed care, it's more of a holistic approach. And yes, this ACE study, the adverse childhood experience, is very important. It shows that even if children see trauma happen at a young age, and then they become older and later in life, they'll be more vulnerable to illnesses. It just takes one piece of paper in the doctor's office. It's one form you fill out. Then this can inform them about possible disease outcomes. It's fascinating. It really is fascinating. And then self-care. I didn't know anything about self-care at all. I just kept going through. I just went after it. So that was a lesson I learned through this experience at DAWN is self-care, work-life balance. And the next generation of students that I work with, I tell them to have a good work-life balance. It's very important. It was a very good experience for me working in DC. Now I'm here from DC to Rochester is my goal. I've worked at a nonprofit or in the nonprofit world for over 7 years, doing administrative work and grant writing and many things. I feel like I'm hitting that ceiling. At 3.5 years as a director, what's next? I'm itching for that next step. And I miss the academic part of my world, working in the lab and the research and interacting with other scientists. I always am motivated by professional development and encourage people to increase their skills. So I know that there are healthcare disparities in the deaf community, and I want to help with that. And now there's research happening that is helping the community and helping to minimize those disparities. I want to be involved in that. I'm also fascinated with global deaf health work, such as Chile, Indonesia, and other countries, and how to improve deaf health, even with early intervention and exposure. That's very important. I'm also very interested in deaf women's health. I see many of my deaf female friends, it goes back to this intersectionality issue. They feel very oppressed or that they have many layers, but those are not taken into account, and I want to improve that. So my advice for current and future students, know yourself. Know what you like and don't like. Continue building your knowledge. And don't get fixed or set in this box. Life changes, it's dynamic, it continues to evolve over time. Go with the flow. It's very important. Also, something I've noticed, I did not have a mentor. I would meet people, but I didn't have official mentors. It's incredibly valuable to have a mentor that is very similar or same as you. And then, of course, intersectionality issues. You all define your own story. As I mentioned before, I compared myself with hearing individuals and I feel like I'm behind. But no, I don't do that anymore. I define my life from now on. Thank you so much.